All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Caitlin Saladino. I'm the Senior Director of Research and Development here at Brookings Mountain West. And on behalf of my colleagues, Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director, Dave Demore, our wonderful student researcher team, I want to welcome you all to our second talk in the Spring 2025 Brookings Scholar Lecture Series here at UNLV. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our donors to Brookings Mountain West, including Tom Kaplan and Wolfgang Puck Fine Dining, who allow us to continue offering important policy events like the one you're going to watch tonight. We simply could not do the work that we do in the community without their support, so thank you. Another thank you, of course, to our colleagues at UNLV TV here in Greenspun College who are recording tonight's lecture. All of the slides that you will see, as well as the recording itself, will be up on our website in just a few short days, so you can share that amongst your colleagues as soon as that's available. This week, we're delighted to welcome our Brookings colleague, Rob-Maxim, for his first visit to Brookings Mountain West. Like all our visitors, he's been busy learning everything there is to know about the Las Vegas community, meeting with stakeholders, teaching in courses, engaging one-on-one with students, sharing his insight with leadership from state agencies, and perhaps most importantly, taking in his first Golden Knights game. He's practically a local now, guys. Before we jump into our lecture tonight, let me share a little bit about Rob's background with you all. Rob-Maxim comes to us this week from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where he's a fellow at Brookings Metro. Rob's work examines how technological change and other economic trends affect people and places. He's been particularly focused on measuring federal investments into place-based industrial policy, developing more inclusive state innovation economies, broadening access to highly digital employment, and even supporting the missions of regional public universities. Rob has also written about the effects of automation and artificial intelligence on U.S. workers, the geography of the COVID-19 recession, the gig economy and contingent work, and the effects of U.S. tariffs and trade policy. What a time to be an expert on that topic, Rob. Further, Rob is an enrolled citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and leads Brookings research around Native American communities. At Brookings, he's currently raising efforts to resurface the institution's historic engagement in tribal communities, to engage with Native-led organizations, and enable future research centering Native American people. And of course, we're very fortunate to hear more about that important work tonight. After the talk, we're also going to have some time for Q&A. So if you can please reserve your questions until the end of the presentation, please give me some time to get around to you with the microphone for our recording purposes. And without further ado, if you would help me to welcome Rob-Maxim up.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Wininikan Wami, good evening, everyone. And Katapatash, Caitlin, thank you so much, Caitlin. It's really wonderful to be with you all. In addition to everything Caitlin said, I was thrilled to be present when the Golden Knights officially clinched the playoffs. So I feel like a real Vegas guy now, so I've done it all. But thank you all for being here. Natasui Sapuna Kishki Katahanet. My name is Rob-Maxim. As Caitlin mentioned, I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution at Brookings Metro, where I study several topics. Two that are of particular interest to me, and if my mic is cutting out at any point, just let me know and I'll fix it. But two that are of particular interest to me are place-based policy and tribal economies. The lecture you're going to hear tonight will focus on the intersection of those two topics. Nutomas Masipia Kan Wampnom. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. We're the Indigenous people of southeastern Massachusetts, and today our reservation is on Cape Cod. The title of my discussion is Investing in Left Behind Places, Learning from Native American Tribal Communities. Much of my presentation is going to focus on large-scale, place-based policies enacted during the Biden administration. But I also want to focus on this current policy moment, in particular how continued misunderstandings about Native American identity are leading to harmful outcomes for tribes and for Native American people, as well as how states and regions can take the lead on supporting tribes and Native people in a moment of federal disengagement. I won't dwell on this long, but I do want to provide just a bit of my background so you can understand my motivations for doing this work. On the left here is a map of what is today southeastern New England. And this is how it would have looked in the 17th century. So Mashpee, my tribe's community, is circled in red. It was a Wampanoag community on what is today called Cape Cod. After King Philip's War in 1675, which if you rack your brains down to sixth grade history, you might remember, it was the first conflict between European colonists and Indigenous people in North America. Wampanoag people were confined to a small number of what were called praying towns throughout Massachusetts, and Mashpee in particular was one of them. So in effect, Mashpee was one of the first reservations in North America. I was born in Mashpee and grew up on land that was within my tribe's historic reservation boundaries, although that land today is no longer under tribal control. In the center here is the first Wampanoag tribal leaders convening, where leaders from the various Wampanoag tribes first organized to develop a modern identity as the Wampanoag Nation. Second from the right here is my great-grandfather, Charles Whitefeather Harding, who was chief of the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe at the time. And then on the photo of the right is my father, Robert-Maxim Sr., who 2 generations later was the interim chief of the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe, as well as the vice chair of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Council. That's my little brother Ryan in the photo with him. You can actually kind of see my hands there in the left, but sadly the Cape Cod Times decided to cut me out of the photo, so, no core memory for me, I guess. But why do I bring this all up? For me, data and the way that Native people are reflected in it has permeated my entire life. Our tribe didn't receive federal recognition until 2007. Again, context, we met the Pilgrims in 1620, and the federal government decided we existed in 2007, so do the math there. For about half my life, the federal government did not consider me authentically Native American. Until, of course, one day it changed its mind and did. Nothing changed about me, but they changed their mind. So to top it off, my father's Wampanoag and my mom is white, so I'm rarely counted as Native American in data unless I make it clear that I'm Native and want to be counted as such. So this isn't just a professional interest of mine. As a mixed-race Native person who was told by a lot of non-Native people, including the federal government, that when I was growing up, my tribe basically wasn't real, this work is personal to me. I'd like to take you through next a brief overview of some Indigenous-focused terminology that I use in this presentation and in my work. I find when working in the policy space, people feel a fair amount of ambiguity when it comes to Native-related terminology and may be worried about what terms they can use and when. So this section is really to help put you all at ease and hopefully help folks understand when different terms are appropriate when talking about Native communities. And before I continue, I'll caveat this by saying that these are terms that I choose to use in my work. Different Native people may feel differently about each of these terms, so just know that I'm one Native person presenting my views here. I don't speak for all Native people. But with that disclaimer, so there are many Indigenous groups in the United States today. What are the distinctions and what terms are used for each? When you hear the term American Indian, it describes a Native person from the continental 48 states. Indian is obviously an antiquated term, one based on a pretty massive geographical miscalculation about 500 years ago, but it's also become a term that's been reclaimed by some Native people and also has a very specific legal definition. So when you hear me tonight use the term American Indian, I'm referring to Indigenous people from the lower 48. Alaska Natives are Native people from what is today the state of Alaska. Note that it's always Alaska Native, not Alaskan Native, nor is it Native Alaskan. Alaska Native people have a distinct history of relations with and colonization by Europeans and Americans, as well as a distinct legal framework that governs relations between Alaska Natives and the US government. So for those reasons, Alaska Natives are considered a distinct group. American Indians and Alaska Natives together are called Native Americans. Collectively, American Indians and Alaska Natives are the two primary groups of Indigenous people from the American continent who were colonized by and today are part of the United States. Throughout my presentation, you'll hear me use the phrases American Indian and Alaska Native and Native American interchangeably. However, importantly, American Indians and Alaska Natives are not the only indigenous people in the United States. I will refer to the indigenous people of Hawaii as Native Hawaiians. The reason that Native Hawaiians aren't considered Native American are twofold. First, Hawaii is not part of the American continent, having been settled at a different time and by different groups of indigenous people than the Americas. Second, Hawaii did not become part of the US under the same historical circumstances as American Indians and Alaska Natives. The sovereign government of the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown by the US, and Hawaii was annexed in the late 1800s. Today, there are continued debates among Hawaiian people about their place in the United States, and even whether terms like Native Hawaiian are appropriate compared to just Hawaiian. For this reason, there are no federally recognized Native Hawaiian tribes, and Native Hawaiian people do not have federal recognition in the same manner as American Indian and Alaska Native people. Finally, there are other indigenous people, both in the US and throughout the Americas. Samoan people in American Samoa, Guamanian and Chamorro people in Guam, in the Northern Mariana Islands, all of them are indigenous. There are also indigenous people in other US territories. And of course, there are indigenous peoples from every country in the Americas, some of whom have immigrated to the United States and live here today. So that's the landscape of indigeneity and how I think about it when it comes to the US. However, despite these many nuances to Native identity, the way the federal government classifies American Indians and Alaska Natives is not what I think most people, and I would even dare to say what most American Indians and Alaska Natives imagine for ourselves. On the left here is the United States federal government's definition of American Indian and Alaska Native for the purpose of all US statistical work. It says individuals with origins in any of the original people of North, Central, or South America. So right off the bat, the thing you notice is that this is inclusive of individuals who are citizens of First Nations in Canada, or maybe indigenous to other countries in the Americas. It even lists Aztec and Maya as two examples that you can write in. But crucially, these indigenous groups don't have a recognized nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. And as you'll see from my lecture, this is a really critical distinction, especially given the current legal moment we're in. This definitional ambiguity also has a substantial impact on federal statistics, because who counts as American Indian and Alaska Native extends well beyond just federally recognized, state recognized, or other tribal groups in the US. And beyond just these definitional issues, federal data about Native people and Native communities has really significant quality issues. The graphic on the left here shows the extreme variance in data on Native American people across 3 different government data sets. The total count of Native Americans, in particular, this is the total count of Native Americans across the 3 largest census data sets, the decennial census, so the one we take every 10 years, and then 2 versions of the Census's American Community Survey, which is what the US government uses to fill in data in the 9 years between censuses. Taking these 3 data sets in total, the count of Native Americans, so the US government's official count of Native American people, varies by 32% across these 3 data sets, representing over 3 million people. It's basically like, if you believe the data literally, if you believe what the US government is saying, what they are saying is anywhere from 1.2 million to 3 million Native people just disappeared between 2020 and 2022, and nobody heard anything about it. That is like what, if you were to take this data at face value, it is telling us. And just for context, the variance for the US population as a whole across these 3 data sets is 0.6%. So again, compare that to 32% variance for Native people. So if we know this data is this inaccurate at the national level, it's going to face even worse issues at the tribal and community level. And then the graphic on the right here shows a separate problem with federal data. Native American people are classified as multiracial or multi-ethnic at a higher rate than any other group in the United States. Over 3/4 of Native people are, in both the United States as a whole, but also in Nevada, are classified in federal data sets as either mixed race, so 2 or more races, or Hispanic. However, many federal, state, or non-governmental data sets, think about things like CDC health data, Department of Education, higher ed access and attainment data, only include single race, non-Hispanic Native Americans in their data. That's the bottom orange wedge in the pie there. So when you see data sets that have data across different groups, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, 2 or more races, that Native American column often accounts for less than 25% of the entire Native American population. This is a problem that non-Indigenous people don't face. So next, I want to take you through a couple of the major motivating factors in my work, in particular, the growing economic divergence by place in the United States. Since the early 1990s, a small group of economically vibrant, we call them superstar metropolitan areas, have been pulling away from the rest of the country. Here you can see the top 2% of metropolitan areas in the US had substantially faster income growth than other metropolitan areas of all sizes in the country. To view this trend another way, during the recovery in the 2010s after the Great Recession, job growth was perfectly rank ordered by community size, with large metropolitan areas growing the fastest and non-metro adjacent rural areas actually seeing negative growth. A major factor in this economic divergence has been the growing importance of innovation-focused knowledge work in the US economy. So here work from my colleagues Mark Muro and Jacob Witten in partnership with Rob Atkinson of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation showed that just 5 metropolitan areas, Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, and San Diego, accounted for 90% of all growth in innovation sector jobs from 2005 to 2017. So this is the backdrop and the place-based orientation motivating much of my work. So here I put together a high-level comparison of Trump and Biden's respective approaches for responding to this growing place-based divergence with policy. And I just want to say, I promise I did my absolute best to be nonpartisan here. It is just objectively difficult to make this slide appear even-handed when these are the official portraits of the last 2 presidents, so just please forgive me if, it is what it is. But to talk about the content, Trump has largely responded using 4 themes. First is an extensive use of tariffs. Again, this is a driving headline today, right? And I'll just note here that some of them have been walked back or delayed in the past. And the situation seems to change not only day by day, but sometimes hour by hour. So really right now, it's hard to say anything definitively about the Trump tariff approach. Next, his administration has embraced deregulating the energy sector, but particularly the fossil fuel sector, to promote industrial development for fossil fuel communities. Third, his administration, including his nominee for labor secretary, has embraced growing union support, but thus far has had limited pro-worker policy actions. And then finally, the administration has claimed that immigration enforcement is a policy tool for supporting US workers in economically distressed places. I put ostensibly here on the slide because I do think it's fair to question the true motivation behind the administration's immigration enforcement and the extent to which it'll actually help US workers and communities. Joe Biden, for his part, leveraged tariffs as well. He maintained many of the tariffs put in place during the first Trump administration and imposed other trade barriers, such as major trade restrictions on semiconductors with China. His administration also signed into law major bills that promoted clean energy and infrastructure development, much of it focused on economically distressed and historically marginalized communities. And within those laws were provisions to support growing worker and union power. And then finally, the Biden administration enacted an array of place-based industrial policies, which are, of course, the focus of this presentation. So when we say place-based industrial policy, what do we mean by that? The Biden administration was the first US administration in recent history to openly and enthusiastically embrace industrial policy. The Biden administration sought to respond both to the COVID-19 recession in the United States, as well as broader economic distress by deploying targeted investments to achieve multiple distinct but related goals. These goals included reversing industrial drift and languishing innovation investments, responding to geopolitical competition and national security, especially with regard to China, bolstering supply chain resiliency, solving the climate crisis, and reducing growing interpersonal and place-based inequality, as well as strengthening fraying democracy. The Biden administration aimed to achieve those goals with investments made across 4 historic pieces of legislation: the American Rescue Plan Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And critically, much of this investment was place-based. At Brookings Metro, we define place-based industrial policy as policies that encourage economic transformation through interventions in particular industries, as well as that seek to leverage concentrations of talent, suppliers, and knowledge that cluster and interact in place to spur greater economic development. So my colleagues at Brookings Metro and I have identified and tracked a total of $80 billion in place-based industrial policy spending since 2021. What I'm going to do now is give an overview of both how Nevada and Indian country fared in accessing these place-based awards, and then share a bit about the state of Indian country in the current policy moment, as well as steps that states can take to continue supporting tribal communities in economically distressed places more broadly. So in total, Nevada won 13 place-based industrial policy awards, accounting for 1.4% of all industrial policy awards in the US, place-based industrial policy awards. So in that metric, actually Nevada fared relatively well, overperforming its 1.1% share of the US population. But those numbers look less good when you look at the size of those awards. Nevada was awarded just 0.5% of all place-based industrial policy funding. So while the state did all right in the total number of awards it won, with really 3 exceptions, it received mostly smaller planning grants or tourism-focused awards. For awareness, the Circle, the major grant in Southern Nevada, was a $57 million battery materials processing and battery manufacturing recycling grant to the region. And in case folks are wondering, you actually see a similar pattern with other federal funding streams for Nevada. So if you take the infrastructure law grants that came to different states, again, Nevada fared all right in the total number of awards, winning awards on pace with its population, but really, again, underperformed in total award dollars. So this is a challenge that the state has and a theme that you see consistently across federal investment. And then just to emphasize the importance of this federal funding, it's not just about the federal dollars themselves. Communities leveraged federal funding to secure about $500 billion in private sector investment commitments between 2021 and 2023. So having this federal funding was critical to spurring private sector investment to grow regional economies. But again, looking at Southern Nevada, you can see during the time period of this analysis that the region was largely bypassed by major follow-on private sector investments, a result of the relative scarcity of federal dollars flowing into the region compared to other places. So that's the Nevada story, and in particular, the Southern Nevada story. I'd like to turn now to a discussion of Native communities in Nevada and across the nation, and how tribes and Native peoples fared in these place-based investments. So just to level set, this is a cursory look at several different measures of Indian country in Nevada. I'm sure you're all more familiar with these maps than I am, but I did want to just share a visualization of the geography of Indian country in the state and in the region. While most of the reservations in the state are concentrated in the north, there are 3 in Clark County. And in addition, Clark County has the largest population of Native American people in the state, with over 60,000 residents in the county being classified as American Indian or Alaska Native. And then on the map to the right, you can see that Mineral County has the highest share of residents classified as American Indian or Alaska Native at about 25%. Before I get into the data, I know this is a text-heavy slide, but I really want to emphasize the importance of place-based policy for Native people and Native communities. I and others have made the argument that Native people are the most place-based people. You see, so what we have here, it's the definition of Indigenous peoples used by the World Bank. Within it, you can see the importance that the concept of land plays in how Indigenous people think about ourselves on a cultural level. You see key themes that we share collective ancestral ties to land, and that land and natural resources are inextricably linked to our identities. In other words, one's sense of indigeneity is quite literally place-based. It's also, I think, important to note that in the United States today, the rights of Native people and Native nations are often legally prescribed by place, whether that be a reservation boundary, a town boundary, a state boundary, or some other physical location. Also crucial to understand is the fact that Native American residents, and in particular Native people on reservations, still face economic challenges that are more severe than nearly any other group in Nevada or the nation. Here's just a quick overview comparing the well-being of American Indians and Alaska Natives on tribal land in Nevada compared to Native people in the state as a whole and all Nevada residents. And I'll just quickly note, so while this is the best federal data available, it's based on 5-year estimates that were published in 2021. So like I said at the beginning, federal data on Native Americans and tribal communities is grossly inadequate and inaccurate. But looking at the numbers we do have, we see that unemployment for Native Americans on tribal land in Nevada is over twice as high as the state's overall unemployment rate. And unemployment for all Native people in the state is over 3 percentage points higher than the state as a whole. You see that same trend play out with the poverty rate for Native people on reservations almost 2.5 times higher than the state's overall rate, and the poverty rate for all Native Americans being about 1.5 times higher than the state average. And Native people on reservations in Nevada have a median household income of just over half of the state median. And all Native Americans in the state have a median household income $10,000 below the state median. So place-based policies could be a crucial opportunity for transforming tribal economies. But how did tribes fare on winning these awards? Native communities saw a similar pattern to Nevada, to the state as a whole. So this is looking at national awards here. Tribes did well in the total number of awards they won, but similar to Nevada as a state, tribes lagged significantly in their amount of funding. So my analysis of Biden-era place-based industrial policy awards, I found 115 awards that served tribal communities in some capacity. I define that as the award had a tribe or Native organization that was leading as a partner or an applicant for the award, that the award name-checked Native or Indigenous communities as a key funding recipient or stakeholder, or that a tribal reservation was listed among the geographies that will be served by the award. So I basically tried to take like the broadest and most generous definition possible. So the good news is that these 115 awards account for 12.3% of all of the awards won. I actually think that's actually quite good. Nearly 1 in 8 awards served a Native community in some way. But when you looked at the actual funding amounts, the story changes. While Native communities were involved in over 12% of all awards, those awards generated only 2.5% of funding from these programs. And generally speaking, I think there are 2 factors at play here. The first is I think there are a lot of Native-serving awards, Native-serving coalitions and awardees that won planning grants, so small grants to do a strategy, but not an actual implementation grant to implement that strategy. And second, the CHIPS Act semiconductor incentive funding, which was by far the largest federal incentive given out by the Biden administration and accounted for about half of all place-based industrial policy, largely bypassed tribal communities. Next, I look at how Native-led coalitions fare. So this is the column to the right. These were coalitions that were led by a tribe or a Native-serving organization. So there were 75 awards that went to Native-led awardees, which accounted for 8% of all awards. Again, I think that's pretty good. It actually surprised me with how high it was. But then again, on the funding side, you see the story here, and you see the challenge. Those 75 awards accounted for just half of 1% of all funding across each of these programs. And again, I think that's largely for the reasons I outlined. So the story here is Native communities were involved with and winning awards, but were still largely bypassed by the largest funding opportunities. And then next, I wanted to see what happened when you took out the Native-focused Indigenous Communities Program, which was the place-based program within the Economic Development Administration that served exclusively Native communities. The short answer is that when that one program was removed, that program accounted for almost half of all awards involving Native communities, and over 2/3 of awards to Native-led coalitions. So when you take that program out, you see a 10% decline in funding to Native serving coalitions, and nearly 50% decline in funding to Native-led coalitions. And here, just a quick look at the geography of Native serving awards nationally. Again, you see Nevada underperformed relative to the number of tribes and Native people in the state, winning just 3 awards that involved tribes in some capacity, none of which were in southern Nevada. I do think one thing that's worth noting is that one Nevada award, the $95 million Decarbonizing Gold Mines in Nevada project in the northeast of the state, was actually the second largest Native serving award in the nation. So that is of note. There was one big award. But I'll point out the red circle in Albuquerque, even bigger, that was an award to Intel, which is building the largest chip packaging facility in the nation. As part of that project, Intel committed to supporting STEAM education through investments, annual grants, and other hands-on learning activities for students on Indigenous lands. So as other states were thinking about investments in things like chip factories and the industries of the future, they were thinking about tribal communities as well. It was a mixed bag in Nevada. All right, now I want to pivot to talk a bit about the current federal policy moment and how that's affecting tribes and Native people. So unfortunately, the bad news is all of the investments in Indian country that we just talked about are now at risk, as well as potentially many other federal supports for Indian country. First, here are a few examples of how the Trump administration's recent elimination of programs that it perceives as, quote, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, are hurting Indian country. Here in Nevada, just last week, the Walker River Paiute tribe saw a $20 million grant from the EPA canceled. The grant would have transformed the tribe's water system, which struggles with limited capacity and low water pressure. It would have retrofitted 150 homes for energy-efficient improvements and constructed a community resilience hub for natural disasters. But the grant was canceled when the EPA closed down its Department of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, which oversaw the program. It ended up putting all of the staff of that program on leave, so that no one's even working in that office anymore. To add insult to injury, the Nevada Independent also reported that the Department of Agriculture canceled an agreement with the tribe that provided it funds to purchase food grown within 400 miles of the reservation, so throughout Nevada, and distribute it to community members through its food pantry. And for context, that food pantry is used by about 40% of the reservation's population. On the left here are the keywords that the Trump administration is censoring in government functions or using to flag funding for review and possible rescission. So here you can see the terms Indigenous community, Native American, and tribal are all included on the list. And then in the lower right is a headline noting the recent memo from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to halt all race-conscious programming in higher education, which has caused some universities to disband their initiatives to support Native American students. And then there are instances of broader federal funding cuts having significant impacts across Indian country, including in Nevada. Of note, I thought it was interesting that the one agency that at one point took steps to mitigate such cuts, at least before really last week, was the Department of Health and Human Services, which rescinded recent layoffs at the Indian Health Service. In contrast, the Department of the Interior, which leads most executive branch activity in Indian country, proceeded with layoffs and service cuts. And then just last week, we heard news of about 20,000 workers at HHS were laid off. So kind of all of the goodwill that had been built up was negated. And one of the, I think, most pernicious stories that I heard is that, kind of as a cruel twist, the HHS department offered for any laid-off employee, if you want, you can move to the most rural reservations in the U.S. and take a job at IHS, dangling it as if it's like an insult or punishment to workers rather than something that's core to the mission of the agency. So I think all of this shows the overall incoherence and lack of shared understanding within the Trump administration in how trust and treaty obligations to tribes work. It's my view that recent federal actions have made it more critical than ever that more Americans understand Native American identity. More specifically, I think that more Americans need to understand that federal funding to tribes and to Native American people isn't based on race, it isn't based on so-called DEI, and it isn't based on need. Rather, this is my view, and I think it's shared by many Native folks, nearly all federal funding to tribes and Native American people can and should be seen as fulfilling the U.S. government's trust and treaty obligations to tribes. On the right here is a quote from the U.S. Supreme Court case Morton v. Mancari, in which the justices found that an Indian hiring preference at the Department of the Interior could not be characterized as racial discrimination. Indeed, the court found, such a preference is not even a racial preference because being a citizen of a Native American tribe is not a racial identity, but rather a political one, just as citizenship of any other nation is. So I mentioned, this is again a text-heavy slide, so bear with me, I'll take you through everything. I mentioned federal funding to Native people is based on something called trust and treaty obligations. But what are those? In exchange for the land that now encompasses the US, the federal government entered into a series of treaties and agreements that obligated them to provide material benefits to tribes and Native American people. These obligations generally have no expiration date. To the extent that the US continues to occupy the land, which I think will have no expiration date, they owe obligations to the tribes with whom they sign treaties. These trust and treaty obligations are implemented through a series of federal programs, often using the very flawed data around American Indians and Alaska Natives that I've shown and outlined throughout this lecture. And again, here on the right here is another U.S. government document, quote from a U.S. government document outlining the distinctions that Native people have from other groups in the United States. So this is, again, hopefully the last text-heavy slide, but I think it's important to have all this here because this outlines my philosophy of how I think about trust and treaty obligations. Well, there are probably some smart lawyers who might tell me I'm misreading this. I always look to the U.S. Senate's 1977 American Indian Policy Committee report when I think about how to engage on investment in tribal communities. The authors of that report wrote that there's little reason to so restrict the trust doctrine other than administrative convenience. There's legal authority that the United States trust duty is much broader. The Senate found that trust and treaty obligations include all of those services required to protect and enhance Indian lands, resources, and self-government, and also includes those economic and social programs which are necessary to raise the standard of living and social well-being of Indian people to a level comparable to non-Indian society. When I read these words, I think that makes the case for a broad definition of trust and treaty obligations, and that we should be more inclusive rather than exclusive when we talk about what counts as obligations to tribes. All in, there are 37 different federal agencies that provide funding to Indian country. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I will say is I would argue that the funding coming from these agencies, all of this funding in its entirety, is what accounts for the U.S.'s trust and treaty obligations to tribes. So right now we've got a moment of federal government disengagement in Indian country. I think that this moment, regardless of kind of what direction it goes in the federal level, presents an opportunity for states and regions to engage more fully with tribes and Native American people, if they're interested in doing so. States and regions have historically had a really ambiguous relationship with tribes for multiple reasons. First is they don't have set trust and treaty obligations with tribes the way the federal government does, although there are some organizations like the United Southern and Eastern Tribes that argue that they do. Second, tribes often prefer to interact with the federal government, to exercise their sovereignty independent of states. Third, and along those lines, tribes are often exempted from state and local law except where Congress has legislated otherwise. And then finally, some states have historically had a really contentious relationship with tribes. So all of these reasons have made, I think, states and regions reluctant historically to engage with tribes and vice versa. But as the federal government turns its back on tribes, I think there's a real opportunity for states and regions to begin to deepen their partnerships with tribes for the benefit of both Native people and non-Native people alike. So what I'll do here is quickly take you through a few of the findings that we've had from our recent research, and I think that are worthwhile for local leaders to know. So this is just a list of 7 key findings from several Brookings research reports that we've done in partnership with tribes over the last 2 years. So the first finding is that it's crucial that policymakers and government officials understand the concept of trust and treaty obligations. But what we've found is there's significant variation in how well they do. I've found that understanding is scarce outside of the Department of the Interior on the federal level, or agency-level tribal liaisons in offices of tribal affairs on the state and local level. Second, relationship building and sustained investment are critical for effective economic development in Indian country. Native people, and I think this is a pretty universal sentiment. I usually hesitate to talk in kind of blanket terms around Native communities, but I think it is true across the board that Native people are extraordinarily relationship-based. So even well-intentioned federal, state, or local agencies can struggle to support Native communities if they lack Native staff and deep experience in Indian country, or at least a sustained commitment to sticking through and serving tribal communities even when things get difficult. Third, misguided policies against DEI and race-conscious policy threaten recent policy gains made by Native communities. This is because, as I note in item 4 here, equitable economic development requires investment into coalitions led by historically underrepresented populations, including Native communities. But this doesn't just matter for Native communities. It matters for historically invested communities of all types. So again, I think lumping Native communities in as just DEI or another minority community belies the fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between the federal government and tribes. Fifth, many existing federal and state funding models disproportionately burden tribes and Native-led funding recipients. So two of the most pernicious examples of these policies are competitive grants and matching funds. Native communities, which tend to be less well-resourced than other communities, often struggle to raise matching funds. Meanwhile, competitive grants, I think, violate the spirit of trust and treaty obligations. You're basically telling tribes they need to compete with one another to access funding raised off the land that was stolen from them. So these barriers often cause Native-led entities to self-select out of competitive grant programs. But again, this doesn't just apply to Native communities. These policies cause coalitions for many historically underinvested communities to opt out of or struggle to compete for large federal grants. Sixth, policies designed to increase access to funding for tribal communities are often too narrowly tailored. One example that came up in our work in recent years is that the federal government often offers matching fund waivers for tribes, which is great. However, it often doesn't do so for Native-led nonprofit entities like community development financial institutions or tribal colleges and universities, which face many of the same cash flow problems as tribal governments. And then finally, poor data creates barriers to community and economic development for tribes. While data is a key enabler for accessing funding, existing federal and state data sources are often inadequate for tribal needs, as we've discussed in this lecture. Here too, this isn't just relevant for Native communities, but really for many small demographic populations, and in particular, rural communities. So to close, I will touch on just a few of the key policy steps that I think states and regions can explore to support Native communities and other historically underrepresented populations. This is by no means a comprehensive policy agenda. Rather, what I'm aiming to do here is just scratch the surface of a few areas that I've worked in and can hopefully provide a jumping off point for state and local policy for engaging with tribes, as well as other historically underinvested communities. So starting from the left here first, I think it's worth it for state legislatures to pass legislation affirming that investment into Native communities is not based on race, but rather a government-to-government political relationship. In a moment where tribal investment is being classified as DEI, these types of steps, even if symbolic, are important. For other historically underinvested groups, states can adopt standards such as the Federal Social and Economically Disadvantaged, or SETI, standard to continue investment in those communities, even as race-conscious policy comes under increasing scrutiny. These steps will allow continued investment into communities in a moment of need, but one that is also a moment of heightened scrutiny and threatening many recent policy gains and economic gains in some of these communities. Next, state and regions should better fund and grow the work of tribal liaisons and offices of tribal affairs, both to deepen state-tribal relationships, but also to grow awareness of the unique circumstances and rights that tribes have within state and local government. States and regions can also expand tribal representation on states and regional bodies such as metropolitan planning organizations. And then finally, states should explore bans on sovereignty waivers for tribes. In our work with tribal communities, we've heard that states, regions, and private investors will often require tribes to waive their sovereign immunity to access funding or services. This leaves tribes, in effect, facing a choice between undermining their own sovereignty or missing out on crucially needed investments. So I think it's time to end that kind of false binary for tribal governments. Next, in the middle column, to facilitate economic growth, I think states should begin exploring how to create place-based investment initiatives for reservations and Native communities, modeled on many of the federal industrial policy programs that we've discussed today. But I think there are ways that states can model these to work better for tribal communities, including things like leveraging formula grants rather than competitive grants, and using really flexible funding rather than prescribing exactly what funding uses the money needs to go to. In addition to Native-focused programs, states and regions should really create more place-based federal funding, or place-based funding streams for all distressed communities. As I discussed previously, these programs should put an emphasis on funding and supporting coalitions that are led by entities from historically underinvested communities. Next, I think more needs to be done to grow funding for entrepreneurship in Native communities, as well as other historically underinvested communities. Entrepreneurship can be an important pathway into the labor market in places where formal employment opportunities are rare, including both rural reservations and economically distressed communities. Entrepreneurship is also an important tool for building wealth. And research by the Minneapolis Fed's Center for Indian Country Development has shown that Native Americans living on reservations have the lowest level of wealth of any group in the United States. One of the challenges, though, is that many of the most lucrative funding mechanisms for capital access bypass Native people and other underrepresented groups. When you look at venture capital, for example, why does that matter? Well, only 1% of firms receive venture capital funding. Over 60% of firms that IPO have involved venture financing in some capacity. But data from the Kapoor Center indicates that less than 2% of founders receiving seed funding or Series A funding were Black, Latino, or Native American. So not only Native communities, but other historically underinvested communities are totally missing out on this really crucial lifeline for capital access. I think states can take a variety of actions to bolster entrepreneurship in Native communities and other underinvested places. One model is the Federal Indian Business Incubators Program, which states and regions can explore creating more localized versions of. States and regions could also fund intermediary organizations that support underinvested groups, such as the national group Powwow Pitch, or look to other regions, such as the program Ascender in Pittsburgh, for examples of the type of supports that underrepresented investors and entrepreneurs need. And then finally, states can create state-level models of federal initiatives, such as the State Small Business Credit Initiative, also known as SSBCI, which can further grow funding in underrepresented communities. And then third, I think we need to talk about education. Last week, the Trump administration announced it was laying off half of the staff of the Department of Education. That's a big deal for Native communities because ed provides a significant amount of funding for education of Native people at all levels. So now is the moment for states and regions to step up to support education for Native communities and other historically underinvested groups. The good news is that Nevada has already taken several crucial steps that I typically recommend for places. The state has a law requiring that Native history be taught in all schools, though I'm not clear on how well that kind of filters through the actual classroom. It waives fees for Native students at its public institutions of higher education. But again, it's thinking about actions to narrow that law right now. And it's taken steps in recent years to make its education funding formulas fairer. However, there's obviously still work to do, and it's not clear if the policy design, again, is flowing into communities. However, it's encouraging the state is thinking proactively about its education system. I think it's really important that the state continue on a path to progress there. And then finally, here on the right, there's a lot that needs to be done to support Indigenous data needs. I'd say a first step for every state and region should be to develop an Indigenous data strategy in partnership with tribes to help foster closer data relationships between states, regions, and Native communities. Next, state and regions should work with tribes to improve the quality and accuracy of data on Native people in state, regional, and local data sets. States and regions can also provide funding to help tribes scale up their own data capacity and also allow tribes to submit their own data in lieu of badly outdated federal and state data to access funding opportunities. So again, this agenda is by no means comprehensive, but reflects much of the learning that we at Brookings have had in the past couple of years while working in partnership with tribal leaders and Native serving organizations. So on that note, I'd like to say katapa tanamu. Thank you all for your time and for inviting me to be tonight's speaker. This is my contact information for those interested in reaching out, or if you want to follow me on social media. And so I'm really looking forward to opening up the discussion and really would be happy to go in whatever direction you all want to take it.
Questions?
I've just answered everything. That's it. No questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Miguel. I am a regional planner here in Southern Nevada, so very interested in the role that regions could play in promoting economic development in underinvested communities, specifically if they're place-based. So I'm really interested, how do we, typically in economic development, there's this narrative of like, the bigger the acres, the bigger the jobs, right? Like the big industry that you can ensure that you capture those headlines, that's really what drives success for a lot of our economic development professionals, not just in the region, but around the country. How do you combat that? How do you present a different narrative about the smaller scale investments, the investments in relationships and people and small businesses? What advice do you have?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. I think the first is in a lot of places you're kind of and I think about Native communities in particular, you're kind of starting from a much kind of lower industrial base. And so, you know, you're really dealing, I think, with a lot of the blocking and tackling of community development rather than like the big swings of economic development. We're talking places that likely don't have fiber laid at the same rate. So there are, you know, obvious barriers there. They might have really basic infrastructure challenges around things like paved roads, sewer systems. Some houses might not have running water. And so for me, as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about like community and infrastructure development as the first step for all of this. And that was why so many of the Biden era initiatives in infrastructure were hugely critical for tribal communities. On a kind of broader scale, I try to think less about the framing of like we're getting a certain number of jobs in a project or we're doing a certain siting. And I think about it in terms of what are the core industries and assets that regions need to support kind of long-term growth. So you might want to take a look at some of the work we've done at Brookings around advanced industries. These are the 50 or so industries that have the highest levels of STEM R&D and STEM employment and private sector R&D in the US. Some of them are manufacturing, some of them are services, some of them are energy. The reason they matter is it's not just because of their raw job counts. They are high paying, they pay about twice the national average, but it's not even about that. These are the industries that account for 90% of private sector R&D in the US, 60% of our exports. The typical non-advanced job supports 0.8 other jobs in the US economy. Advanced industries support about 2.5 jobs for every advanced industries job. So when I'm thinking about like what are the investments you want to make in place, and what I would like more federal and state economic development folks to think about with regard to tribal economies is how do you engage places in this advanced industry economy? It shouldn't just be about raw job count. It should be about how are we building these industries, these tradable industries, these high supply chain industries that can serve as the economic anchors for regions and communities. And so that's the area that I focus in, and you might want to take a look at some of the work we do on that.
Other questions?
There's also no question that is too basic. Do not be if there's anything you've ever want to ask about Indian country, I'm happy to talk about it.
I'll kick things off with maybe one. Just curious, you've looked at the nation as a whole and sort of wondering, a place like Nevada, are there best practices or examples in other states where you see really well-defined relationship between state or locality level and Native communities? Is that being done well in other places, and what could Nevada learn from those places?
Yeah, your neighbors to the west in California are doing a lot to think about this on two levels. On the state level, their Office of Tribal Affairs has been running a multi-year effort to think about the state's legacy with tribes. There's a pretty dark history of colonization in that state and the deliberate suppression of treaties there. And so their state is reckoning with some of that history and how today investment in tribal communities can help serve as almost a form of reparations for the actions the state has taken. And then on the regional level, you have a couple regional organizations, including MPOs, that have taken some really cutting-edge steps to develop formalized relationships with tribes through MOUs, through voting membership on their regional planning organizations, and through inclusion as levels of government, just like any other local or regional government in the state. And so they're being incorporated. In the Southern California Association of Governments region that I've been working in, the mayor of LA is sitting at the same table as, tribal chairman in many cases, because they're all voting members of the same bodies. So I think that there's, we'll have some research hopefully coming out in June, looking at some of the stuff California is doing, and I think there's a lot that Nevada could learn from that. And I'm definitely interested in exploring Nevada deeper if that's of interest.
Probably have time for one more question. Sure. Thanks. Who was it?
Thank you, Rob, for this. I'll try and make this a question. Talking about how place-based Indigenous people are, what about the tension when their place is so valuable, in many cases, for what's underneath it, whether it's water or something like lithium to bring it home, and externally, one might see that as a huge economic opportunity, but on the other hand, the residents of that place, it destroys the very land that is their home.
Yeah.
How do tribes deal with that?
Yeah. I think this comes back to why the sovereignty discussion is so important. I remember there's an article a few years back in the New York Times where the headline was Biden faces a really critical decision about whether to support mining on tribal land, even if tribes don't want it. And I really hated the framing of that article, because it was tribes kind of have a choice, but only if Biden's okay with their choice, right? And I think that's kind of the framing of a lot of how we think about tribal land in the U.S. right now. We see it as part of the U.S., so therefore the U.S. federal government, even if it's nominally part of a tribe, ultimately has the final say. I really think, this comes back to the sovereignty discussion and the way we frame it. We, in many ways, as policy thinkers, need to start thinking about tribal governments as sovereign governments in the way that they usually would use Mexico and Canada, but I don't even know if those are good examples anymore. But the way that foreign countries, right, are. This was a pitch that was a lot easier to give 3 months ago. That's all I'll say. But I do think that that's part of the challenge, is the sovereignty aspect of this isn't understood by officials, and so it can run into conflict between tribal leaders and non-tribal officials. The important thing to note is that there's no unanimity among tribes or even among people within the same tribe about how they want to engage with their resources. There are quite a few tribes that still rely on extraction industries. You see this in the Dakotas and elsewhere, and you see it in Alaska quite a bit. And in some of those tribes, overwhelming support for those industries, right? Mary Peltola from Alaska, Alaska Native member of the House of Representatives, was very pro-drilling in many cases. And so there's no clear, this is the Native position on anything. What I will say is, it is important for non-tribal leaders to respect the decision of tribes. It's important for them to engage in good faith. They're not always going to get the answer that they want. When they do, I think it's great when there can be mutually shared partnerships, and I think that that's something that places like Nevada can explore more of. And when there isn't, I think that's when the tough learning needs to come in terms of the ability of non-native stakeholders to respect tribal sovereignty and to say, we're still willing to engage with you in good faith, even if we don't agree with everything that, we're doing, or even if you don't want to go along with our plans for your land. So that's how I think about it. But again, it's not universal across Indian country. There are quite a few tribes and Native people that are very interested in a lot of the economic development involved with extraction, and then there are many others that aren't, and it really varies.
Hi, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess my question, and sorry if it's a little basic, but when it comes to the data aspect of where did all the numbers go and that sort of thing, what can kind of be done to counteract that or to fix that or to help that moving forward? Because it sounds like that is a major issue that's kind of causing the problems as they continue on, I guess.
I think the first thing that needs to happen is really these investment in tribes themselves to do their own data work. An MOU based on a shared understanding and protection of tribal data between states, regions, the federal government, and tribes. You saw some of this, last year the census entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Osage Nation for the Osage Nation to begin providing its own data to census data sets. So there are models out there. So that's the first one is I think that the federal government needs to invest in tribes in doing their own data work and enter into these mutually beneficial agreements. The second is I think we need to totally reconstruct how we collect and ask about tribal identity in the U.S. In Canada, in New Zealand, and Australia, they don't ask about Indigenous identity on their equivalent of the race question. They have a totally separate question for Indigenous identity. There's no reason the U.S. can't do that. We do that with Hispanic right now. That's what we do. And then we act with Indigenous, oh my God, it would be too tough to do, right? So I think that could be one way to do it. I think that there's also a lot that needs to be done around the federal government publishing more disaggregated data around tribal communities. So let me give you an example. The Department of Education collects race data and ethnicity data from every college in the U.S. They specifically instruct colleges that if someone identifies as two or more races, classify them as two or more races. If they identify as anything else in Hispanic, classify them as Hispanic, and don't send us any detail about what subgroups those people identify as. The Department of Education is literally we don't want it. So how does that impact tribal communities? Well, from 2010 to 2024, higher ed enrollment for Native people declined by 40%. But we don't actually know if that's the story of Native people. That's the story of the 23% of Native people who are single-race non-Hispanic. We have no idea what has happened to the other 77% of Native students. We just don't know. There's no reason we shouldn't know. The Department of Education could just ask for that data. The schools collect it, but we're choosing not to do that. And so even our data aggregation systems are, they're unconsciously biased against Native people. And I think that we need to talk more about that. And there are so many administrative fixes that in the short run could at least help fortify the flawed data we have now and make it more useful.
If you'll please join me in thanking Rob again for this really thought-provoking lecture. I appreciate it. Thank you. Before you all run off, Rob will be here just a little bit if you have additional questions that didn't get a chance to be answered, so you can come on up towards the podium after we're done. I also want to conclude with reminding you all that our next and final lecture in the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series for the spring 2025 season is actually next week, this exact same day and time, Wednesday at 6, April 9th. Here in Greenspan Hall Auditorium, we'll be joined by our Brookings colleague, Brad Olson, with the Center for Universal Education, with a focus on K-12 education policy. He's going to be presenting a lecture titled Scaling Promising Education Initiatives Locally and Around the World. And we're really excited to hear his recommendations for our education policy landscape here in Nevada as well. So we hope we'll see you then. Otherwise, thank you for being here and have a great night, everyone. Thanks.